some thoughts about Shlach Lecha, this week's Parsha. I was reading back to some of the old Divrei Torah from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, the retired head rabbi of Great Britain. And he quoted something that I thought was interesting in preparing for thinking about the 12 spies in this week's Parsha, or scouts, who were sent on a reconnaissance mission to check out the land of Canaan by Moses. He tells about a Stanford University psychologist named Carol Dweck, who wrote a fascinating book called Mindset, which was on why some people fulfill their potential while other people do not fulfill their potential. Apropos this week's Parsha, 10 of the spies, if you remember, of the 12, and these weren't just anyone, these were heads of the tribes. These were people in positions of leadership. They were go-to people within each tribe. And so going back to the study, Dr. Dweck's interest, she says, was aroused when she observed the behavior of 10-year-old children when given puzzles in school to solve. Some, she learned or observed, when the puzzles became difficult, thrived. They relished the challenge even when it proved too hard for them. Others, when they were starting to get challenged and couldn't put the puzzle pieces together, became anxious. When the puzzles became hard, they were easily discouraged. Now, I would have been in the latter group. I would have said my ADHD would have kicked in immediately. I would have lost interest, not because I was discouraged, but because the capacity to focus was now over. But this was about anxiety versus being up for the challenge, being ready and willing and able to go for it, and excited by the challenge of putting the puzzle pieces together. Dr. Dweck wanted to understand why there was a difference when posed with the challenge between some of the 10-year-olds and the other. What made the ones, on the one hand, between the people who were enjoying the challenge being tested and those who were not? What makes some people grow through adversity while others become demoralized when presented with a challenge or something that is difficult? And so her research drove her to the conclusion that it is a matter of, the name of her book, mindset. It's the difference between how you think about what it is that you're doing and the different perspectives on that. Some see their abilities as given, these are my abilities, this is what I can do, it's limited, and it cannot be altered. In other words, I have skills, I have abilities, I can do certain things, and then there's a limit. I can't do any more than that. We're just as gifted or ordinary, and there is not much that we can do about it. She calls these people who say, I can do what I can do, and I can do no more. She calls them fixed. They have a fixed mindset, she says. But the others in the study, she believes, that were the ones who enjoyed the challenge and thrived and got really excited when they were pressed, these people are people who grow through effort. And when they fail, they don't define it as a failure, but as in other words, they don't feel badly about themselves, but as a learning experience. And she calls these kids the growth mindset, those with a growth mindset. So there's two types of mindsets that she outlines in her book. Some are fixed mindset, and others are growth mindset people. And those with the fixed mindset avoid difficult challenges. They get up and they walk away because they are scared of failure. They think it will expose them as inadequate, like they're worried about what other people will think of them if they can't, in this case, complete the puzzle. So they're reluctant to take, they're not just risk averse, they are risk, it's off the table. They play it safe. But the people with the growth mindset are different. They don't just, as she says, seek challenge, they thrive on it. The bigger the challenge, the more they stretch. When do people with a fixed mindset thrive? When things are safely within their grasp. If things get too challenging, they lose interest. Whereas the people with the growth mindset thrive on the challenge. They enjoy it. That's where they have fun. So the fixed mindset lives with the constant fear of failure and what other people, namely themselves and others, will think of them if they fail. The growth mindset doesn't think in terms of failing at all. It's just another opportunity to learn something new. And worst case scenario, we learn that we don't know how to do it. Big deal. So let's go to the spies. There were 10 spies, accordingly, right, who come back with the report of fear and dread. 10 of the spies come back, and in this week's Parsha, in Numbers chapter 31, they say, "We will not be able to go up against those people. They are stronger than we are. The land through which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature," giants. And they go as far as to say, this is about the self-esteem part, they go as far as to say later on, "We were like grasshoppers in our eyes, and so we were in their eyes as well." In other words, the fixed mindset group of 10 go and say not only what they thought of what they saw, but then went as far as to say, and this is what those giants, inhabitants, thought about us. They thought we were grasshoppers, not only in our own eyes, but now they're implanting in the natives, the inhabitants of the land, well, we're the natives, the inhabitants of the land, projecting their fears onto them. Sound familiar? Yes, of course it does, because we all do this. The two, Caleb and Joshua, however, have what she calls a growth mindset. They come back, right, and they learned that someone, whoever it was that got scared, then started to scare all of these other people. They came back and said, "We got this. The land is flowing with milk and honey. There's lots of people there, sure, but look at these big grapes that were brought back." Remember the famous pictures of the grapes on the that they're carrying in that actually became the symbol, the logo for the tourism ministry of Israel. They come back and say these Canaanites are no big deal. They learn that someone who takes adversity as a learning experience rather than as a failure, in Dweck's terminology, this growth mindset, they didn't fear failure. Plus, they knew two other things that the other group didn't. Number one was that God was on their side. They experienced, all 12 of these scout spies, they all experienced the 10 plagues, they all experienced the crossing of the Red Sea, and they all experienced the giving of Torah. What do we have to fear? Same God has our back. Nothing to worry about. But you see how the fear of the other 10 got so bad that they had all forgotten about all of that, all these miracles. They forgot that God was on their team. And there's a second thing that they knew, and this is from the Kotzker Rebbe. The Kotzker Rebbe said that the spies were entitled to make the first claim, but not the second. In other words, they were able to say, yes, it's scary, there are these inhabitants who are giants and we're grasshoppers, but they had no business ever to state what ideas the inhabitants had about them. They had no business to project their fear onto the inhabitants in that grasshopper verse. He says, they, the 10, were terrified of the Canaanites and failed to see what Joshua and Caleb knew, which was that the Canaanites were actually terrified of them. Why? Because their reputation was, these are some bad people, good, bad people. They're tough. They got God. This God totally schmeiced the Pharaoh. Their God totally makes miracles for them. Their God totally, they're bad. Cool. And so actually the Canaanites were scared of them. Does this sound familiar too? We project our fear onto other people who were actually not scared of us. They were maybe a little bit nervous or intimidated by us, but our fears got the best of us. So Rabbi Sachs goes on to say the following. People who are like Caleb and Joshua know that if they fail, they will try again until they succeed. it can't be coincidence that the two people, Joshua and Caleb, among the spies, among the 12, who had the growth mindset were also the two who were unafraid of the risks and trials of conquering the land. Nor can it be accidental that the 10 others, all of whom carried the burden of people's expectations as the leaders, the princes, the leaders of their tribes, were reluctant to do so, right? They were given leadership as the leaders of the tribes, but maybe they were reluctant not only as leaders, but reluctant to actually make the hard decisions and the hard choices. If you remember, one of the many punchlines of this story is, because of what the 10 spies reported, God says, all of you, all 603,250 of you, will not be able to enter the land of Israel. You can't handle it. Except Caleb and Joshua. Of all the people who left Egypt, only 2, not even Moses, not even Aaron, not even Miriam, none of these other spies would be allowed to enter the land of Israel except for Caleb and Joshua. And so what do we have to learn? Well, we have many things to learn from the story of Shlach Lecha and the spies and the study. There really are 2 types of people, 2 types of leaders, one faced with adversity. Not those, we always think there's this one type of person who runs away. There's a person who runs away from the challenge, who wants nothing to do with the challenge, who says, I fear failure. They don't fear success, they fear failure. And look at the outcome of fearing failure. No one gets to go into the promised land. And then there are those who look at something that is scary or potentially adverse and says, we got this. My guess is that most of us have a little bit of both in us. Have a little bit of both. And what I'd like to think about, what I'd like us to think about this Shabbat, is not some psychobabble thing about fear. Everyone has fears. Everyone has fears. We all get scared. But what I want us to think about is when confronted with a tricky situation, be it a puzzle or a crossword puzzle or any kind of puzzle. I mean, anyone who does the New York Times crossword puzzle every day feels not smart. I feel like my brain, when I do it, my brain is just not up to it. And then it's one of those easy answers, but they spelled it and did it in a cute way, and then I feel really not smart. I mean, thank God for Google, because you can close the app with the New York Times crossword puzzle, go on Google, cheat. I cheat all the time. Because if I can just get that one word, then I can get the 6 other words, right? And then I feel, but when confronted with it, real fear, real challenge, real dread, do we have the capacity to take the risk? And the answer is absolutely. Not only do you have the capacity to take the risk, but you have a little spark of God in you, and that's what gives you the edge. That's what the 10 didn't realize, is that they had this edge, and that edge was God. For the rest of us who are not risk averse, it's okay to make a mistake. For us, mistakes, adversity, challenges are just another thing to learn from and maybe not do the next time, or maybe tweak the next time so that we can ultimately be successful. We're not driven to succeed. We're driven by the challenges that life presents us. We're driven by the challenges that life presents us. We accept that there are challenges. And one of the great things that we learn from this parsha is that there is this paradoxical relationship when it comes to this truth of what to do, of to live in fear or with fear. And on this Shabbat, I would like to ask you to think about, what would you rather do? Would you rather live in fear or with fear? I think it's better to live with fear as opposed to in fear. It's a liberating truth, Rabbi Sachs says. The fear of failure causes us to fail. causes them to never be able to enter the promised land. The fear of failure causes us to fail. That's what causes us to fail. It's the willingness to fail that allows us to succeed. And there's the paradox of this parsha. And what happens? The two win. God knew they were going to go into the promised land anyway. Why? Because God promised it to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And God doesn't lie. If God makes a promise in Genesis, it's going to get fulfilled at the end of Deuteronomy. But they didn't know any better, these 10. They were going to go anyway. And we know in our lives, when faced with challenges, sometimes the outcome has already been determined by forces greater than us. It's how we do what we do, how we move through our lives, how we move through these processes, whether it's leaving a job, or whether it's moving, or whether it's to have kids, or it's to where to send them to college, these are real situations. We have risks. And we've learned in Jewish teaching that to be a person of faith does not exempt you from bad things happening to you. There are no promises in this world and in this life. There is only the promise that you are capable of succeeding, that you are capable of failing, and as a result of your failure, to succeed. But that we will never, ever succeed if we live with the fear of failure. God made us, wired us different. And so on this Shabbat, I encourage us to think about living in fear or with fear, our fears of failure, as opposed to what it means to succeed, to not fear failure. Think about all these concepts. I hope you'll come to Torah study tomorrow morning, and together we can all right, you know what? That was going to be the end, but now I'm adding 10 minutes as a punishment. Shabbat Shalom.